The key that had opened my father's front door for 23 years suddenly did not work. And that was the moment I realized grief was not the worst thing waiting for me after the funeral. 3 days earlier, we had buried my father, Frank Collins. The service was simple, exactly the way he would have wanted it. Friends, neighbors, family members, and people whose lives he quietly helped over the years filled the small church outside town. I spent most of that day trying to hold myself together. Losing a parent changes something deep inside you, no matter how old you are. At 68, I thought I was prepared for it. I was wrong. After the funeral, everyone gathered at my sister Rebecca's house for a meal. Conversations drifted from memories to practical matters. Who would handle certain paperwork? What would happen with Dad's house? At the time, nothing seemed unusual. Rebecca appeared emotional but composed. We hugged goodbye that evening, and I drove home believing we would face the coming weeks together as sisters. The next morning, I decided to visit Dad's house. For years, I had helped him manage things around the property. I watered plants when he traveled. I picked up prescriptions when he was not feeling well. I had my own key because he wanted me to have one. Family should never be locked out, he used to say. Those words stayed with me as I pulled into the driveway. The house looked exactly the same. The white shutters, the flower beds beneath the windows, the old oak tree near the mailbox. Everything felt familiar until I reached the front door. I inserted my key into the lock. It would not turn. At first, I assumed I was distracted. I removed the key and tried again. Nothing. I checked to make sure I was using the correct key. I was. A strange feeling settled in my stomach. Then I noticed something I had missed earlier. The lock itself was different. Brand new. Shiny. Recently installed. I stood there staring at it for several seconds. Surely there was an explanation. Maybe a locksmith had been called after Dad's passing. Maybe Rebecca forgot to mention it. I pulled out my phone and called her. She answered on the second ring. Rebecca, I said, trying to keep my voice calm, I am at Dad's house. The lock has been changed. There was a pause. Not a surprised pause. A prepared pause. Yes, she finally replied. I had it changed yesterday. I frowned. Why? Another silence. Then came words I will never forget. Because you do not need access anymore. I actually thought I misunderstood her. What do you mean? Her tone hardened immediately. I mean exactly what I said. Dad's house is being handled. There is no reason for you to be there. I looked at the front door that had welcomed me for decades. Suddenly it felt like a stranger's house. Handled by who? I asked. By me, she answered. I am taking care of everything now. Before I could respond, she ended the call. I stood alone on the porch listening to the silence that followed. A neighbor waved from across the street. I forced a smile and waved back. Inside, however, my thoughts were racing. Rebecca had never behaved like this before. Not after Mom passed away. Not during Dad's illness. Not even at the funeral. Yet somehow, less than 72 hours after we buried our father, she had changed the locks and decided I no longer belonged there. As I walked back to my car, one question repeated itself over and over in my mind. What was she so determined to keep me from seeing? Over the next several days, the feeling that something was wrong only grew stronger. I called Rebecca twice more, hoping the conversation at least might calm my concerns. Instead, each call left me more unsettled than before. She refused to discuss the house in detail. Whenever I asked direct questions, she responded with vague answers. Everything is under control. The estate is being handled. There is nothing you need to worry about. The words sounded reasonable on the surface, but the tone behind them felt completely different. Rebecca was not sharing information. She was shutting down questions. That alone would have been unusual. What made it worse was how quickly everything seemed to change after Dad's funeral. A week earlier, we were standing side by side greeting family members at the church. Now she was acting as though she alone possessed authority over every decision connected to our father's life. The following Friday, I drove past Dad's house again. I had no intention of confronting anyone. I simply wanted to see whether anything looked different. As I slowed near the driveway, I noticed a pickup truck parked beside the garage. Two men were carrying boxes out of the house. My grip tightened on the steering wheel. I pulled to the curb across the street and watched. Neither man appeared familiar. Several trips later, they loaded the final boxes into the truck and drove away. I sat there staring at the house. Why were belongings being removed? Who authorized it? What exactly was happening inside? Before I could decide what to do, another car pulled into the driveway. Rebecca stepped out. She saw my vehicle immediately. For a brief moment, our eyes met across the street. Then she turned away and walked into the house without acknowledging me. The message was impossible to miss. She did not want me involved. That evening, I called several relatives who had remained close to Dad over the years. Most knew very little. Everyone assumed Rebecca and I were working together. One conversation stood out. My cousin Carol mentioned seeing Rebecca meet with a real estate agent earlier that week. At first, I thought she must be mistaken. Dad's estate had not even been settled. Why would a realtor be involved? Yet the more I thought about it, the more the pieces began fitting together. The new locks, the removed boxes, the secrecy, the refusal to answer questions. Every new detail pointed in the same direction. Rebecca was behaving like someone who already considered the property hers. The realization hurt more than I expected, not because of the house itself, because of what it suggested about trust. My father believed families should work together. He spent years reminding us that relationships mattered more than possessions. Yet somehow, only days after we buried him, those lessons seemed forgotten. The next morning, I searched through old family files stored in my home office. Dad had always been organized. Birth certificates, tax records, insurance documents, and property papers were carefully arranged inside labeled folders. While sorting through them, I noticed something interesting. Several documents referenced meetings with an attorney named Daniel Foster. I recognized the name immediately. Daniel had handled legal matters for Dad for many years. Suddenly, a question formed in my mind. If anyone knew what Dad intended regarding the house, it would be the attorney who helped prepare his estate documents. I looked at the business card clipped inside one of the folders. Then I looked at the clock. His office would still be open. For the first time since discovering the changed locks, I felt something other than confusion. I felt the possibility of answers. Daniel Foster returned my call the following Monday morning. His voice sounded older than I remembered, but still steady and professional. When I introduced myself, there was a brief pause before he responded. "Margaret Collins," he said. "I was very sorry to hear about your father." We spoke for a few minutes about Dad and the funeral. Then I carefully explained what had happened since his passing. I told him about the changed locks, the unanswered questions, the boxes being removed, and Rebecca's refusal to discuss the estate. Daniel listened quietly without interrupting. When I finished, the silence on the line lasted several seconds. "I think we should meet," he finally said. "There are some things that may be easier to discuss in person." The appointment was scheduled for Wednesday afternoon. During the 2 days leading up to it, I found myself replaying old memories. Dad was always deliberate when making important decisions. He believed paperwork mattered. He believed records mattered. Most of all, he believed people should understand what they were signing and what they were agreeing to. The more I thought about those values, the harder it became to believe he would have wanted one daughter completely excluded from matters involving his estate. Wednesday arrived with clear skies and unusually warm temperatures for late spring. Daniel's office sat in a small brick building near the courthouse, the same building Dad had visited countless times over the years. Walking through those familiar doors felt strangely emotional. It was another reminder that Dad was gone. Daniel greeted me personally and led me into a conference room. Several folders were already arranged on the table. He began by expressing sympathy for my loss. Then he opened one of the folders and reviewed basic information about the estate. Most of it seemed routine. Property records, financial summaries, administrative paperwork. Nothing immediately explained Rebecca's behavior. Then something unexpected happened. Daniel stopped reading. His eyes settled on a page near the bottom of the file. He adjusted his glasses and studied it again. The room suddenly felt very quiet. "Is something wrong?" I asked. He looked up slowly. "Perhaps not wrong," he said, "but definitely unusual." My attention sharpened immediately. Daniel turned the document toward me. It contained references to property access and estate administration. The legal language was difficult to follow, but one detail stood out. According to the records, no final authority regarding the house had been granted to any individual family member. Certain procedures still needed to occur before those decisions could be made. I frowned. Then how could Rebecca act as though everything belongs to her? Daniel folded his hands thoughtfully. "That is exactly the question I have." He continued reviewing documents for nearly 20 minutes. Several times he paused to compare records from different folders. The more he reviewed, the more concerned he appeared. Finally, he leaned back in his chair. "Margaret, I am beginning to suspect there is information missing from this picture. Missing information. The phrase stayed with me. It explained why everything felt so confusing. Every action Rebecca took suggested certainty. Yet the records Daniel reviewed did not support that certainty. There was a gap somewhere between what the documents showed and what my sister believed. Before our meeting ended, Daniel asked permission to conduct a more comprehensive review of the estate records and related filings. I agreed immediately. As I stood to leave, he said something that stopped me at the door. Your father was one of the most thorough clients I ever worked with. I turned toward him. What does that mean? Daniel smiled faintly. It means Frank Collins rarely left important matters unresolved. Driving home that evening, I thought about those words. Dad rarely left important matters unresolved. If that was true, then somewhere, hidden within years of paperwork and planning, there might already be an answer waiting to be found. And for the first time since discovering the changed locks, I began to believe my sister knew far less than she claimed. 2 days after my meeting with Daniel, I received a phone call from someone I had not spoken to in nearly a year. The name on my screen was Linda Parker. Linda had been one of my father's closest friends for more than 3 decades. They attended church together, volunteered at community events together, and spent countless afternoons drinking coffee on Dad's back porch. If anyone understood how he thought, it was Linda. The moment I answered, I could hear concern in her voice. Margaret, I heard about the funeral and everything that has happened since. We spoke for several minutes before she asked if we could meet. There was something important she wanted to discuss in person. The following afternoon, I drove to her small house on the edge of town. Linda welcomed me inside and served coffee exactly the way my father liked it. For a while we shared memories of him. Stories about fishing trips, holiday dinners, and the countless projects he always seemed to be working on. Talking about him felt comforting. Then Linda became unusually serious. There is something I never thought would matter, she said. But after hearing what happened with your sister, I think you should know. My attention sharpened immediately. Linda stood and disappeared into another room. When she returned, she carried a large envelope. The edges were slightly worn from age. She placed it carefully on the table between us. Your father gave this to me about 3 years ago. I stared at it. Why? Linda smiled sadly. Because your father trusted paperwork more than promises. That sounded exactly like him. She explained that after a minor health scare several years earlier, Dad became more focused on organizing his affairs. He reviewed documents, updated records, and made sure important information was protected. During one conversation, he asked Linda to keep a copy of certain papers in case anything ever happened to the originals. He said families sometimes become complicated when emotions and property get mixed together, she said quietly. The words sent a chill through me. Dad had never spoken to me about that conversation. Slowly, I opened the envelope. Inside were copies of several legal documents. Some were familiar, others were not. Among them was a signed letter written entirely in my father's handwriting. As I began reading, my heart started beating faster. The letter described his wishes regarding the house and the estate. More importantly, it repeatedly emphasized fairness between both daughters. Not one daughter, both daughters. Linda watched silently while I continued reading. Several passages felt remarkably specific. Dad wrote that no significant decisions regarding the property should occur without proper legal review and participation from all interested parties. He even referenced concerns about misunderstandings arising after his death. By the time I reached the final page, I felt as though he was speaking directly to me. Did Rebecca know about this? I asked. Linda shook her head. Not that I am aware of. We spent another hour reviewing the contents together. Nothing in the envelope provided a complete answer. Yet it offered something equally important. Confirmation. Dad had anticipated potential problems. He had prepared for them, and he had taken steps to preserve evidence of his intentions. That evening, I delivered copies of everything to Daniel. The next morning, he called. The moment I heard his voice, I knew something significant had changed. Margaret, he said, I have reviewed the documents from Linda. They connect several pieces of this puzzle. I sat down immediately. What does that mean? There was a pause. Then Daniel answered with words that made my pulse quicken. It means your father may have left behind protections your sister never knew existed. Daniel asked me to come to his office the very next day. The urgency in his voice told me this was no ordinary update. When I arrived, several folders were spread across the conference table. He had highlighted pages, attached notes, and organized documents into neat stacks. The moment I sat down, he slid one particular folder toward me. "I think your father anticipated a situation very similar to what is happening now," he said. My heart immediately began to race. Daniel opened the folder and pointed to a collection of records connected to Dad's estate planning. Some of them came from the copies Linda had preserved. Others came from files stored within his own office archives. Individually, the documents seemed ordinary. Together, they told a very different story. Dad had spent years updating and refining his estate plans. More importantly, he had documented his intentions repeatedly. Daniel showed me letters, meeting summaries, signed instructions, and legal memoranda prepared during consultations. The same theme appeared again and again. Fair treatment, shared access, joint participation. Dad was remarkably consistent. "Your father wanted transparency," Daniel explained. "He wanted both daughters informed and involved." I stared at the papers while trying to absorb everything. "Then why is Rebecca acting like she controls everything?" Daniel leaned back in his chair. "Because she may believe she does." That answer surprised me. Until then, I had assumed Rebecca was intentionally ignoring Dad's wishes. Daniel's perspective was slightly different. He believed she might have convinced herself that certain actions were justified. Unfortunately, believing something does not make it legally true. He then revealed the discovery that changed everything. Several years earlier, Dad had established specific protections concerning access to the property after his death. Those protections were designed to prevent exactly the kind of unilateral control Rebecca was attempting to exercise. No individual heir could simply take possession and exclude others before the estate process reached the appropriate stage. I felt a mixture of relief and sadness. Relief because Dad had protected both of us. Sadness because my own sister either did not understand those protections or chose to ignore them. Daniel continued reviewing records. Then he reached a document that caused him to stop speaking for several seconds. He adjusted his glasses and read it again. "This is important," he finally said. The document contained instructions regarding property management during estate administration. Buried within the language was a requirement that major decisions involving access, removal of belongings, or control of the residence required formal authority that had not yet been granted. In simple terms, Rebecca did not possess the power she was acting as though she possessed. Suddenly, the changed locks looked very different. So did the boxes removed from the house. So did every conversation she refused to have. By the end of the meeting, Daniel's concern had transformed into confidence. The documents were becoming increasingly clear. Dad's intentions were well documented. The legal framework supporting those intentions remained active. Most importantly, evidence existed. Real evidence. Not assumptions. Not family arguments. Evidence. As I gathered my things to leave, Daniel handed me copies of several records. "Keep these safe," he said. I nodded and placed them carefully inside my bag. Then he added one final comment. "Margaret, if additional records confirm what I believe they will confirm, your sister's position becomes much weaker than she realizes." Driving home that evening, I thought about Rebecca standing inside Dad's house behind those new locks. For weeks, she had behaved as though the story was already finished. Yet somewhere inside Daniel's office, buried beneath years of careful planning, my father had left behind something far more powerful than assumptions. He had left behind proof. The breakthrough arrived almost a week later. During that time, I continued living my normal routine while Daniel conducted a deeper review of the estate records. Outwardly, very little changed. Inwardly, everything felt different. For the first time since Dad's funeral, I no longer felt lost. Questions still existed, but now those questions were being answered through documents rather than emotions. One Tuesday morning, Daniel called and asked if I could meet him immediately. The moment I entered his office, I knew something significant had happened. He looked more energized than I had seen him since this began. Several additional folders rested on the conference table. One was noticeably older than the others, with worn edges and faded labels. Daniel tapped the folder gently. "This is what we have been looking for." I sat down and waited. He opened the file and carefully removed several documents. Some were original estate records. Others were amendments added years later. Together, they revealed a layer of planning my father had never discussed with me. Apparently, after helping several friends navigate difficult inheritance disputes, Dad became increasingly concerned about preventing confusion within his own family. As a result, he worked closely with Daniel to create additional safeguards beyond a traditional will. The more Daniel explained, the more everything began making sense. Dad understood that grief could cloud judgment. He understood that assumptions could create conflict. Most importantly, he understood that clarity was one of the greatest gifts a parent could leave behind. Daniel then showed me the document that changed everything. Unlike the other records, this one dealt specifically with authority over the property during the estate administration process. It established clear limitations regarding who could make decisions, who could access the residence, and under what circumstances changes could occur. The language was precise. There was very little room for interpretation. I read several sections twice just to make sure I understood correctly. Then I looked up at Daniel. "Are you telling me Rebecca never had the authority she claimed to have?" He nodded. "Based on everything we have found, that appears to be correct." The room felt strangely quiet. For weeks, Rebecca acted as though ownership and control were already settled. She changed locks, restricted access, oversaw the removal of belongings, discussed future plans. Yet the documents sitting on the table suggested she was operating under assumptions that lacked legal support. Daniel continued reviewing the file. Then he pointed to another section that had somehow remained hidden throughout earlier reviews. This provision required equal notice and participation regarding significant estate decisions affecting both heirs. Equal notice, equal participation. The words could not have been clearer. Dad anticipated the possibility that one person might try to move ahead without the other, so he built protections specifically designed to prevent it. Suddenly, Linda's envelope, Daniel's records, and Dad's handwritten instructions all connected together. They were not separate pieces of evidence. They were parts of the same plan, a plan designed to preserve fairness. By the end of the meeting, Daniel's strategy was becoming clear. Formal action would be necessary. Documentation would need to be presented. Certain records would require review by the appropriate authorities. None of it would happen overnight, but the path forward finally existed. As I prepared to leave, Daniel gathered the documents back into their folders. "There is one thing your sister probably does not realize," he said. I paused. "What is that?" He looked directly at me. "These protections are enforceable." Driving home, I found myself thinking about Rebecca inside the house. She still believed she controlled the situation. She still believed the story was moving in only one direction. What she did not know was that my father had quietly built safeguards years earlier. And now, one document at a time, those safeguards were beginning to come to life. From that point forward, I stopped trying to understand Rebecca's decisions and started focusing on my father's plan. Daniel advised patience. The documents were strong, but proper procedures still had to be followed. Everything needed to be reviewed carefully and presented through the correct channels. It was not the dramatic answer many people imagine when they think about legal disputes. It was slower, more methodical, and according to Daniel, that was exactly why it worked. Over the following 2 weeks, I said very little to anyone about what was happening. Family members occasionally called to ask whether Rebecca and I had resolved our disagreements. I always gave the same answer. The estate is still being reviewed. Technically, that was true. What I did not share was how much the situation had already changed behind the scenes. The evidence continued growing stronger. Every new record seemed to support the same conclusion. Dad's intentions were documented repeatedly. His instructions were consistent. His protections remained active. Meanwhile, Rebecca continued behaving as though none of those facts existed. One afternoon, I received a group email regarding family property matters. Rebecca had sent it to several relatives. The message discussed future plans for the house and referenced decisions that appeared to assume complete authority over the property. Reading it felt strange. A month earlier, the email might have frightened me. Now it simply confirmed how confident she remained. She was building plans on a foundation that did not exist. A few days later, I drove past the house again. The flower beds near the front porch had been rearranged. New outdoor furniture sat on the patio. Small changes, but meaningful ones. They reflected ownership, control, permanence. Rebecca was investing energy into a future she believed was already secure. I parked across the street for several minutes and watched quietly. The house looked peaceful in the afternoon sunlight. Looking at it brought back memories of childhood summers, birthday celebrations, and holiday dinners. For a moment, I felt sadness rather than anger. None of this should have happened. Dad spent his entire life trying to keep family connected. Yet here we were, two sisters separated not by distance, but by trust. Later that week, Daniel called with another update. Most of the remaining reviews had been completed. Additional documentation had been verified. Administrative questions were being resolved. The process was moving steadily toward a formal conclusion. "We are getting very close," he said. Hearing those words brought an unexpected sense of calm. Not excitement, not anticipation. Calm. The truth no longer felt uncertain. It simply felt delayed. During our conversation, Daniel explained that formal action would soon clarify access rights and authority regarding the property. Once completed, assumptions would no longer matter. Only documented facts would matter. That distinction was important. For months, Rebecca operated on assumptions. My father operated on documentation. Documentation was winning. After ending the call, I sat on my back porch and watched the evening sky gradually darken. Birds moved between trees. Neighbors walked their dogs along the sidewalk. Ordinary life continued exactly as it always had. Yet beneath that ordinary surface, everything was changing. For the first time since Dad's funeral, I no longer felt excluded. I no longer felt powerless. The locks on the house had kept me outside physically, but they never changed the truth. And now the truth was moving steadily toward daylight. Rebecca still believed she was in control. She still believed every decision pointed toward the future she imagined. I allowed her to keep believing it. I did not argue. I did not confront her. I did not reveal what Daniel had discovered. There was no reason to. The records would speak soon enough. And when they did, they would carry far more weight than anything I could ever say. The call came on a Monday morning. Daniel's voice was calm, but there was a certainty in it that I had never heard before. "Margaret," he said, "everything is ready." For a moment, I simply sat at my kitchen table staring out the window. The words felt almost unreal. After weeks of questions, records, reviews, and waiting, we had finally reached the point where facts would replace assumptions. Daniel explained that the necessary filings had been completed and the relevant authorities had reviewed the documentation. The protections your father established were recognized. The access restrictions imposed by Rebecca could no longer stand. We arranged to meet later that afternoon. The weather was warm and clear when I arrived at Daniel's office. He handed me a folder containing several documents. One of them carried more weight than all the arguments, accusations, and family tensions that had accumulated since Dad's funeral. It was an official court order addressing access and authority regarding the property. I looked down at the paper and felt an unexpected wave of emotion. Not triumph, not satisfaction, relief. Relief that the truth had finally been recognized. Relief that my father's careful planning mattered. Relief that facts still carried value. Daniel reviewed the next steps. Everything would remain professional. Everything would remain orderly. There would be no dramatic confrontation. The purpose was not to embarrass anyone. The purpose was simply to restore what should never have been taken away in the first place. Later that afternoon, I drove toward Dad's house for the first time in weeks without uncertainty weighing on me. The familiar streets looked exactly as they always had. Children rode bicycles along sidewalks. Neighbors worked in their gardens. Ordinary life continued. Yet for me, this drive felt different from every drive before it. When I turned onto Dad's street, I immediately noticed Rebecca's car parked in the driveway. For a brief moment, old anxiety tried to return. Then I looked at the folder resting on the passenger seat beside me and kept walking forward. Rebecca answered the door after several moments. The surprise on her face was impossible to miss. Her eyes moved from me to the folder in my hands. "What are you doing here?" she asked. Her voice was not angry. It was cautious. I remained calm. "I came because certain questions have finally been answered." She crossed her arms, but said nothing. A few moments later, Daniel arrived as arranged. The expression on Rebecca's face changed immediately. Until that moment, she seemed confident. Now uncertainty began to appear. We moved into the living room where Dad spent so many evenings reading newspapers and watching baseball games. The setting felt strangely appropriate. Daniel calmly presented the documentation. He reviewed the relevant records. He explained the protections Dad established. He explained the authority limitations. Most importantly, he explained the court's conclusions regarding access and participation. The room became very quiet. Rebecca listened without interruption. Several times, she glanced down at the documents in front of her. The confidence I had seen for weeks slowly disappeared. Not because anyone argued with her. Not because anyone raised their voice. Because the paperwork spoke clearly. Every assumption she relied upon was being replaced by documented facts. By the time Daniel finished, there was very little left to debate. Dad's intentions had been preserved. His instructions had been documented. His protections had been enforced. I looked around the room and felt something I had not felt since the funeral. I belonged there again. Not because a court order created that belonging. Because the truth finally restored what had always been there. As the meeting came to an end, Rebecca sat quietly holding the documents. For the first time since this began, she looked less like someone protecting a victory and more like someone realizing she never truly understood the rules of the game. The months that followed were quieter than I expected. After everything that happened, I assumed there would be more meetings, more arguments, more tension. Instead, the truth accomplished what emotions never could. Once the records were clarified and the court order was enforced, the facts became impossible to ignore. The house was no longer a question mark hanging over the family. The uncertainty disappeared. The assumptions disappeared. What remained was exactly what my father intended all along. Shared rights. Clear protections. Proper process. Daniel continued handling the final administrative details over the next several weeks. Every document was updated. Every filing was completed. Every record reflected the legal reality my father spent years carefully creating. When the process finally concluded, I visited the house alone one afternoon. The key that Daniel provided fit perfectly into the lock. It turned smoothly. Standing there on the front porch, I paused for a moment before opening the door. Not because I was nervous, because I was remembering. I remembered arriving after the funeral and discovering I had been shut out. I remembered the confusion, the questions, and the long weeks spent searching for answers. Most of all, I remembered my father. Walking through the house felt like stepping back into familiar memories. The living room looked much the same. The kitchen still carried traces of his routines. Family photographs remained on shelves and walls. Nothing about the house felt like a victory. It felt like a responsibility. Dad never cared about ownership in the way many people do. He cared about fairness. He cared about family. He cared about making sure people were treated properly. The house simply happened to be where those values were tested. Rebecca and I spoke only occasionally after everything was resolved. Our conversations were polite, but different. Some things can be repaired quickly. Trust is rarely one of them. Over time, I came to understand that the greatest loss in this situation was not the conflict itself. It was the distance that developed between two sisters after the death of a father who spent his entire life trying to keep his family together. One evening several months later, I found myself sitting on the back porch watching the sun disappear beyond the trees. It was the same porch where Dad spent countless evenings drinking coffee and talking about life. I brought with me a folder containing copies of the documents that ultimately changed everything. The court order, the estate records, the letters, the protections. Looking through them one final time, I realized something important. None of those papers were really about property. They were about intention. They were about a father who understood that people sometimes make mistakes when grief and assumptions collide. They were about a man who believed the truth should be documented rather than guessed. Linda once told me that Dad trusted paperwork more than promises. At the time, I thought it was simply one of his practical habits. Now I understood what she meant. Promises depend on memory. Documents preserve facts. And in the end, facts protected everything he wanted protected. As the evening sky grew darker, I folded the papers and placed them back inside the folder. Then I looked out across the yard and smiled. My father's final gift was never the house itself. It was the lesson hidden inside everything that happened afterward. Stay patient. Seek the truth.